Tessa really was at a point where, at a year, she was saying her ABCs and singing songs and walking and talking and was ahead of the curve. And then at a year and 6 months, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, lost it all. And she kind of worked her way through that, painful as it was. Yeah. And so I often think of that when I think of you and Jake.
Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And for me, that was in channeling my grief into good. Welcome to the show. So today's guest on A Place of Yes is a longtime friend of mine. I'm sitting with Jeff Ames, and I have known Jeff for a long time. And I couldn't actually remember exactly when we met, except I can tell you that I remember when we got home after Jake was sick, all kinds of people were just like, you and Brian have to meet Heath and Jeff. And it was one of those things where people assumed because we had a common similarity that we had to meet and we would therefore be friends. And we kind of connected. So can you tell the audience a little bit about you and Heath, and then also about Tessa?
I'm a local business owner in town. I own Cantina and part of the Mercantile. And I can't remember specifically when we met, but I think where our stories connect, obviously, center around my daughter, Tessa, who has a really rare neurological epilepsy called Dravet syndrome. We were kind of thrown together. We moved here from New Zealand in 2005, where we had gone to, laughingly, as Heath and I know, live a whimsical life adventure because we had worked really hard in San Francisco and we were in tech and it was just kind of a crazy life. And we thought, this is the last kind of bite of the apple we're going to get because we're going to have this child and it's going to be really normal, intense.
Was Tessa born in San Francisco or in New Zealand?
San Francisco.
Yeah, that's right.
But then we moved to New Zealand when she was 1, and she really had just gotten diagnosed with some severe form of epilepsy. They didn't know specifically that it was Dravet. They hadn't developed a test yet. Interestingly enough, it was developed in Melbourne, Australia, and Tess was in the first cohort of
that I did not know.
10 or 15 people that were diagnosed with
it
officially, that had the genetic code of it. And yeah, she was in that very, very, very first group. Ingrid Schiffers, this famous neurologist in Australia that developed a test for Dravet. In any case, we lived in New Zealand. It wasn't whimsical. It was a beautiful country. We love it. But Tess got super sick. And Dravet is, like so many of these illnesses, a series of falling dominoes where each domino is bigger and more dramatic than the last one. And she really was too much for the medical system in New Zealand, which is great. It's socialized medicine, which is fantastic. Yeah. But if you really need specialized, highly acute, in our case, neurological care, the superstars go to the big cities. They go to London and New York and Boston and San Fran. And the reason we ended up in Saratoga Springs was, one, we wanted to have another child, which we have, Nicholas, our son. We needed more familial support to have that second child. And Heath's parents are fantastic and they live 20 minutes away. And we wanted to be close enough to Boston Children's, which has the best pediatric neurology department in the world. So all those things kind of pushed us in this direction. And that's how we landed here.
So I didn't remember. I was thinking that you were here much longer than us. But if you got here in 2005, we got here in 2006.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's all, in my mind, you were like here and established already.
No. So. And again, those first couple of years when we were here, the early years are the hard years with a lot of the neurological afflictions. Kids get more stable. They get more resilient to minor illnesses that put you in the hospital. And Tessa certainly followed that path as well. But we didn't know anybody for the first couple of years because one month we would be in PICU. Yep. And then next month we would be out and then we'd be back and then we'd be in Boston, and not unlike your own journey with Jake.
No, so it's interesting because I always talk about how those beginning years are so, and especially in that time frame, it's a little different now, I think, with like social media and with all of the different ways in which people connect. But I remember those years when Jake first got sick. So it was like early 2007. And it was just so lonely, kind of, because you couldn't live the life that your friends who didn't have a medically challenged kid could live.
I think when you were going through that process with Jake, he's so young and he's tiny, and all those kids that age are young and vulnerable and tiny and require such intense engagement. And Tess at that point was maybe a bit older. 5 or 6. So it's still a kind of a crazy sine curve. She's sick, she's well, she's sick, she's well. But we'd probably gotten to a stage where we were processing it a little bit better and had kind of a methodology about how we were going to engage with Tessa being in ICU, and kind of had maybe made some kind of a peace with sort of our day-to-day existence, knowing, hey, at any moment, Tess is going to get a cold that a normal child is just, maybe you don't even know they're sick. But with Tess, every time she got sick, she had a status seizure. And every time she had a status seizure, she was in an ambulance off to the hospital. Different journey, and, but we had come to terms with it at that point, I think, when we met you.
Tess was born. So you started to know something was coming up around a year. Is that true?
6 months.
6 months. Okay.
She had her first illness at 6 months, and she had just a little jerk, a little arm freeze that took us to the emergency room. And
so that's, I mean, Jake was 8 months and it was like a weird twitch.
Well, that's what, so the progression, as you know, is gradual and then not gradual. And the signs are subtle and then not subtle. And I'll never forget Tessa's first birthday where her eyes just tracked up like that. And I said to Heath, we still have a video of it because she's blowing out the candle and there's a cake and there's family. And I'm like, you can hear me in the background. I go, did you see that? And he's like, it's chill out. It's her first birthday, it's her first birthday party. But I just saw this little eye thing and it just was not natural. And she'd already had a couple seizures and we were beginning to figure something was bigger. And then that little tick happens once every half hour.
And then it's
once every 10 minutes a week later. And then that progressed to once every minute, once every 10 seconds, then drop attack once an hour, once every 10 minutes. We walked around holding her by her collar for 2 years because
she just
was a one-year-old that walked and ran around just like any other 1-year-old. And then she'd
drop.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
It's wild because that story reminds me of so many that Brian and I would have, right? Yeah. Where like Jake he'd be at a family situation, or he'd be around someone, or like my mom would be holding him or a friend would be holding him. And he would have this like expression, the smile. And people would say like, oh, look at him smile. He's so happy. It wasn't a smile. It was a freaking seizure.
Yeah.
Like it was how his portrayed.
Yeah.
And it was like sometimes Brian and I, not to be twisted, we just kind of like roll our eyes and be like, yeah, great smile. But you knew it was a seizure. Like you become so in tuned to those really tiny things that most people don't even see, or they just see something extremely different.
Yeah. I think what Tessa and Jake, super acute, relatively rare, and just a day-to-day super intense thing. Your antenna is so
up, never down
all the time. You are so hyped and hyper aware about everything that's going on. If you haven't lived it,
you can't even.
And I don't want other people to live it, and you don't even know.
How old is Tessa now? She's 22.
22, yeah.
That's incredible.
Crazy.
It's awesome.
Tessa is. And I think I've got this right. She is at, Boston Children's, and they have the biggest cohort of Dravet kids in the world, and she's the oldest one.
So this is a hard question to ask. Is there like a lifespan of Dravet?
Gotten better because the meds are better. Don't really know. SUDEP is the thing that every parent with a intractable seizure disorder fears: sudden unexplained death by epilepsy. There isn't a time that we go into Boston Children's that the doctor, our neurologist, says.
Do you still see the same?
Yeah, she's amazing. Anna Perduri, Dr. Perduri at Boston Children's is fantastic. She still says, you guys, I'm just letting you know that SUDEP is a thing. She has to kind of tell us that.
To say it. So I think I told you the other day I was walking on Spring Run and Tessa, and I forget her name, but her
Tracy,
yep, was holding on to her, and she was walking, and I was like, hi, Tessa. And, she'd know who I was, but I love it. Like
she's easy to spot.
She's easy to spot.
But terrible walker, terrible decision maker. It's a whole thing. She needs Tracy with her at all times, and thank God for Tracy.
No,
she's super fantastic.
A topic that comes up, and I'm kind of going out of order, which where I even thought we were going to go, but jealousy comes up, and I get jealous. And I think sometimes when I say that, people are like, oh, are you jealous that your kid is, that you didn't have two healthy kids or stuff? I'm not. I am jealous of you right now because I am jealous that you have a diagnosis, that you have that you have information, that you have obviously that you still have Tessa, and that she can walk down the street with like a Tracy. Like, I mean, all of those things. And jealous is, I don't know that it's 100% the right word.
I totally get it though.
But like I feel like I wish I knew then all the things I know now. And I only know them because Jake died, right? Like I know them through the loss, and I know them through the work we did or do in Jake's Help from Heaven. And I know that because I chose to like throw myself into this stuff. But I still like feel the most like feels like when you talk about like Tessa, like that is, it's a world that I miss so much. And it's a world that isn't, it's, I talk about sometimes it's like I'm two moms, right? Like I was
Yeah.
Jake's mom's and Ethan's
Yeah.
mom. And you can probably talk to this a little bit too. Cause
100%. Yeah.
Because you have Nikki and Nikki is going into senior year.
Yeah.
Also wild,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah.
You just, one doesn't prepare you for the other, where I think in other situations when there's siblings, right? Like one
Yeah.
kind of can prepare you for the other.
Yeah.
And I feel like these are two very different journeys.
Yeah. Well, the jealousy part. Tess is an amazing,
She's awesome.
unbelievable,
And you get
incredibly
all of those...
loving. The richness of the experience of being her parent and living with her, and particularly now that she's more stable, knock on wood, it's fantastic. I mean, there oftentimes either I will come home after a tough day and we'll sort of say, I get Tessa, meaning
just a slump.
Tessa's just to slump next to her, just to be around her. She's just the best.
It's jealousy a little bit, right?
100%.
Like, it's just this.
Because the experience, again, it's so personalized. If you're an outsider, I always say this when Heath and I are with Tessa and we're walking through the world. I mean, it's a whole thing. And she is majestically impaired. There's just no lot. It's really kind of hard for some people to even process. It's such a great, rich relationship that we have. And we're so grateful for it.
No,
and
it's it's so beautiful, and I just think about, sometimes people would think about Jake and they would be like, oh, but he doesn't walk and he doesn't talk and he doesn't really respond. And they wouldn't, I don't think they ever mean harm by it, right? But they can't process it, to your point, right? Like they just they don't have the ability to really know what that is.
Yeah.
But when you are connected to kids like ours, right? I would know if Jake was having a good day or a bad day.
Yeah.
Brian would know. Even frankly, Ethan at 5 years old or 4 years old would know.
Sure.
Like, he was just, they were connected. How is Nikki with Tessa? Like, what is their relationship?
He's great with her.
He doesn't know any different either.
He doesn't know any different, right? And our life is so locked in to what it is. There are no spontaneous moments. There's no, let's bomb over to Paris and see the Olympics for 3 days, whether you can or cannot do that. There's nothing like that. So everything is very planned and sort of squared up in our life. And thanks to Heath, mostly.
Yeah.
Nikki that's the world that he knows and the world that we inhabit on a day-to-day basis. Tessa thinks he walks on water and is super desirous of his attention. He's a classic 17-year-old teenage boy, super kind. And, that's a tough journey for Nikki as well. There are significant periods of our time where Heath and I are just 100% locked into trying to keep Tessa alive. How does a 3-year-old boy process that, or a 7-year-old boy, or he's a super sweet kid. He's really empathetic and kind, and we're super proud of him. And it's just a lot.
They get it. And they get that the world isn't always fair. And while they can still be very typical, mad at mad at their parents or want things are unfair. But like, I think Ethan has always had a perspective that is a little bit different than some of his friends.
Every now and then the meteor comes crashing through the roof. Other people don't have meteors.
No, they just don't.
Or they come out of the blue.
Think are meteors are really not.
Yeah.
And I think that is the piece.
Your world hopefully expands to normalize it. And Heath and Nikki's world has expanded to normalize the day-to-day world of Tessa. I mean, we say it all the time. As she goes, we go, and so as long as she's going good, then we're going good.
Yeah, absolutely. I have 2 stories about your connection with Jake. One is they were both on the same non-FDA approved medicine at the same time, Jake and Tessa.
Clobazam back in the day.
In the day.
Approved now.
Now approved, but at that time.
I think we were getting it from Canada, and it was coming in through Boston Children's, and it had
to
be couriered to our house.
It was
all wrapped up in red
craziness.
tape.
And once I think we had, ours got stopped at the border once, and the shipment didn't come. So I'm like, Jeff.
Thankfully, we were on the same. Yeah, I think you called Heath, and I drove them over.
Yeah. Knocked on the door.
I mean, we were in that's a highlight of the world we shared at that time, which 100%. Was one, it was a new construction of a classic med, particularly helpful for kids with our.
Well, I remember it was our doctor at Boston was like, this isn't FDA approved. I want to try it for Jake. I remember it was the first time Brian and I Like we almost like we didn't know what to do because it was the first time he had stopped twitching because he was just constantly like
So
in
when we
motion.
first took it with Tess, her life was not a life worth living. She was just constantly seizing. And the doctor that first dialed us up was a guy who was at the Mayo Clinic because he prescribed that med. But she stopped having seizures for 2 weeks. And had never had a day, never had an hour, never had a 10-minute period where Tess didn't have seizures at that point in her life.
It's almost like you don't know what to do with yourself.
Pretty blown away by
Yeah.
it. That hierarchy of meds, that medley of meds that had Jake survive, they got so much better.
That's so much better.
There's so many kids at Boston Children's when we talked to our Dr. Perduri that they have Dravet parents with Dravet kids, and they'll have one seizure a month, and they're distraught, as they should be.
Yeah, but they don't.
Personal note: Tess had 10 seizures last night, and woke up right as rain, happy as, ready to eating her Cheerios and singing her songs. I'm grateful that the technology has evolved so that these kids that really had a tough go of it have really much more streamlined go of it. Not that everybody gets efficacy from these meds, but it's gotten so much better.
I'm bringing the recurring theme of jealousy. Like I do, like if he could have just survived, right? Like
Yeah.
I think about.
I've thought that throughout this conversation, by the way, because Tessa really was at a point where, at a year, she was saying her ABCs and singing songs and walking and talking and was ahead of the curve. And then at a year and 6 months, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, lost it all. And she kind of worked her way through that, painful as it was. Yeah. And so I often think of that when I think of you and Jake. I wonder if he could have stayed strong enough to power through those phases.
I think of that so much because he, you know the story at 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, he was keeping up with his big brother. He was self-feeding.
That's the hardest part.
It's like, because you saw it and you knew it was there, and then it just, and I've said this.
It's the hardest part.
It's the hardest part. Like, and I wish I knew sometimes, or maybe I'm happy I didn't, like, but that night before, like, I don't remember, like, I'm getting older. I don't remember shit, but I can remember that night before he woke up with the twitching arm. It was Ethan's second birthday party. Family was in town. Friends were in town. Jake was like the life of the party. Like, he was such an easy baby that like anybody could, like, I didn't have to like feed him or hold him or do anything. Like, he could just go to anybody. And there's part of me that just like, and again, I don't know if I really wish it, but like, that was the last time I saw him smile. Like, that's the last time he belly laughed. It's the last time he like sat unassisted. You know what I mean? Like,
I know what you mean.
Like, I still can't wrap my head around that. And I just wish, like, if he could have just, like, if we could have, maybe we didn't stop at Bay State and got to children sooner. Like, if, the whole, like, woulda, shoulda, coulda, it does me no good. I do think of, like, the meds now. I think of, like, the stuff we do with Jake's Help from Heaven and some of the equipment now.
Yeah.
Like, none of that existed. Like, if Jake had a chill-out chair, he'd be sitting cool, you know, like.
He would have become what he would have become, right? Just like Tessa has become. It's super fantastic. It's super intense. We're lucky that we're able to live the life we live, and we're lucky that we have the support we have, and we're lucky that we have this fantastic aide who's now been with Tessa for 10 years.
So I'm going to go back to the day, right? I'm going to go back to the day that Jake died and Heath was over. I think about that all the time. I think about sitting there with her, and I remember saying like, oh, he's in the Spica cast. I think he's depressed. What I loved about that relationship with Heath, and it's still there, she could come over and it wasn't like, oh, what's wrong? Like, we could just sit there and shoot the shit. But we just had this like really very great day because it was hard. Like, you couldn't, when he was in that Spica cast, you couldn't leave the house really. Yeah. I didn't know what I meant when I was saying this, but I remember saying it to several people, Heath included, being like, because we were taking him off of some of his meds at that point, like, because we had felt like he was just zombified too much. It's like, okay, maybe we'll take off a little med. He might have a little bit more seizure activity, but he's going to understand that he's going to be part of his life. That was the trade-off. Like, we wanted more of our boy back. We wanted that peace. And so he was on a little less meds. But I remember saying to Heath, it's almost like he now knows how much this sucks. Yeah. Like, how much it sucks that he's in this cast, and I feel like he's depressed. Not even knowing what I meant by that, right? But like, I just was like, he was with it enough because we had reduced the meds enough that he was kind of like meh. And it was just hard. Like, I think he had maybe like a little bit of an ear infection. Like, you couldn't listen to his chest because the cast was up to here. The whole thing was a mess. But regardless of that, we had zero idea. Like
Yeah.
when Heath left that day, Kate, his nanny, had left that day. Like none of that in my mind was going to end where it did. And then he died, and that was just this horrible, horrible experience and whatever. So fast forward to his services, right? I don't know that how important this was to me or whatever, but like you and Heath came separately because of Tessa. But when it was like the receiving line or the wake or whatever, I remember standing there. Heath had left, you had walked in, and I saw you walking in. Like I can still picture this. So this is the impact that you had. And I left where I was standing and I ran over to you because of all those people there and all of those people just trying so hard to be nice and not, just everyone was sort of pissing me off, not for anything they had done, right? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, oh, I can't believe this happened. Oh, you're so strong. Like all the things that people say and don't mean anything by it. And you walked in and I was like, you know what? He's not going to say anything fucking stupid.
Bummed. Super
He's
bummed
just
for you.
bummed. And he rightfully understands. He knows that feeling of that fear. Because you live a little bit when your kid is sick with that fear. And the worst thing, it happened to me. I hope it does not happen to you, God. But like, I just felt when you walked in, there was someone in this world that would just give me a hug and I remember very little of some of that, but that I remember you coming in.
I don't remember the name of the movie. Sliding Doors.
I talk about that in this show a lot.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
I mean, you just
Yeah.
walk through the door that we never want to walk through.
Yes.
And I have been at that door with my hand on it, trying to keep it shut when whatever the force is behind it is trying to pull it open and grab Tessa through it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way that Heath and I look at you and Brian a lot. I mean, we see the magnificent adventures that you get to go on and the life that you get to lead, which, by the way, as you well know, and we've talked about, if Jake were around, it would be a different world and different adventures and a different constraint to that kind of a lifestyle.
So she just had COVID not too long ago.
Yeah.
How did that? Is that the first time she had it or she had it before?
Second time. I will say it's the first time in her life that she has ever had a significant illness, a flu. Back in the day, like you were talking about Jake with an ear infection. An ear infection could send Tessa to spiking fever, status seizure, aspiration,
snowball,
intubation for 2 weeks, hanging by a thread. It's the first time she's ever gotten something that like is a significant illness, and she just powered right through it. So the very first time in her total life. So Heath, unfortunately, was really sick, but I was like, God, Tessa's doing great. Right.
Sorry,
honey. Exactly.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah.
We lead such a sheltered life with Tessa. Tessa didn't go outside for 2 years. I mean, when I say didn't go outside and interact, she did not go outside or interact with anybody for 2 years. Pulled her out of school. She lives in a complete, I think that if I could wrap that girl in bubble wrap and put a plexi box around her and drive her around in the Pope Mobile, that's how we would live our life, that she would no germ would get to her.
The only time in my life where I was sort of like, thank God Jake is not here anymore, was during COVID. Some people are like, how could you say that? But exactly what you said, like that would have been an entirely different form of lockdown. And we were all pretty locked down, you know what I mean? Like, and so many of our families, I mean, some still haven't gone back to school because they're just so scared of it now, or scared of all of it because it's, we talk about the ear infection, but like in the heart of COVID, and I got COVID early on, like in one of those first rounds of it, it was horrible.
Yeah.
And I just, for someone who one ear infection turns into a double ear infection, turns into strep throat, turns into pneumonia almost every time.
Yeah.
And then you couldn't going to the hospital wouldn't be a safe place, right? Like, so then what if they get sick? They go to the hospital where they can get better. During COVID, you couldn't. Like,
well, Tessa, the first time she got COVID, of course, ended up in ICU and went to the hospital and was in a pretty bad state. But this time, just like every other illness that Jake or Tessa would get, or any parent of a special needs child, you just sit around and stare at them. We just start the vigilant watch.
Looking for the thing that is.
We'll go out and you walk back in the door and how's she doing? Have you taken her temp? What's her O2 level?
How do you guys navigate that? Like, because Brian and I used to sometimes, I don't want to say bicker, but like,
oh God, it's a battle.
Yeah, it's a battle sometimes.
Because the one person you trade it off. Somebody is on double alert, DEFCON 5, and the other person, maybe it was me, I'm working and and then I'm diving into back home and it gets super intense. But that's you're in such a,
heightened, I think is a good word.
That's a trapeze act at that point. You're walking along this razor thin line and you're carrying your family on your, by balancing them, and anything can knock that out of balance. And so super tense.
It's hard sometimes because it's like you're navigating different worlds, right? And I think
I just always say, we live on Mars. The gravity's different. The sun sets at a different time. It's colder. It's windier. It's harsh.
Yeah.
And so it's great that you live on the earth. And I've lived on the earth and I continue to live. But when I'm in that state, we're on Mars and you don't know anything
about life.
No offense, but it's intense.
So there's one last section of things that I would like to discuss with you. One of the themes of this show that we talk about with a whole variety of guests is, grief. And in the beginning, to me, grief was very traditional. And it was very like, well, I'm grieving because I lost my son. There are so many different types of grief. I had no idea. But there's this thing called like ambiguous grief. People would say to me when Jake was still alive, or especially when Jake first got sick, like different doctors and different therapists, they would be like, you sort of have to grieve the life you thought you were going to have. And I, at that point in my life, would get mad. No, I don't have to, because I kind of felt it was disrespectful to Jake, frankly, to grieve him differently. But it turns out there's a thing that people do. It's like ambiguous grief, it's called. Do you think about the life that could be, there's these weird, now we're doing philosophy here. Yeah.
Giant
question. Just a casual question for you.
God, it's just kind of different phases. And I can't speak for Heath because she's so much more in touch with her emotions and emotionally mature. Everybody has to work through that on their own way. I would say the first phase of Tessa's life, it was quit our jobs. Heath had a great job with a tech company in San Francisco. I had my own tech company in San Francisco, still owned the Blue Light in San Francisco, the bar restaurant that we owned. We were living this particular life and, living in San Francisco in the late 90s, early 2000s was kind of where you wanted to be. It all just stopped just so fast. And so I think of that first phase, it was so intense and so involved that I personally, we quit our jobs. We had moved to New Zealand. We were all by ourselves. We just stood around and kind of stared at Tessa and it was just the two of us. Yeah. And so kind of a really unique period that kind of kept her alive. Without that space, we would have had probably a different outcome. Yeah. I don't really have time to grieve them because she was so fucked up, so sick.
You just are in it all of a sudden.
Day to day. And when you had a good week, you just kind of wanted to leave it and go to the beach, try to be normal, right? I know there's a world that we don't get to inhabit. And I know there's a whole life that we used to have that we don't get to have anymore. I mean, Tessa's just couldn't imagine living without her. And she's just so loving and she's completely dependent on us. And we're actually completely dependent on her too. And it's just the life that I now know and inhabit daily.
Is the life you love.
So It is the life that we love. It's really challenging and it's super limiting. And there is no, like I said, there is no randomness to it at all. There's no, I'm going to just go bounce and do X. It all has to be staged, planned, whatever, but it's the life I know. So,
and it's worth it.
And I will say one other thing. Heath and I don't even remember because it was so long ago. We just kind of accepted it. I mean, it was super hard. I think probably harder for Heath, but we just kind of got on with our business. It was sort of like, this is it. This is what we have to deal with. Thank God we can quit our jobs.
Yeah. Thank God
and not work for 5 or 6 years. And we had the good fortune to have a life that we could just stare at Tessa. I was super grateful for that period that we were able to pull that off.
It's not entirely different than like the things that Brian and I do now because Jake's not here. Or, they're all, we're in this life. Like I would not do the things we do now to be back in that life. And
there's not a summer that goes by that there isn't a moment, a week or something where you say to yourself, God, I wish I could do that. But it's been 22 years now.
So some people probably who are listening are in our situation, right? Where all of a sudden they're in the situation we were in when you're knowing something is wrong. You don't have a diagnosis yet. You're trying to figure something out. What would you say to someone?
Again, we had touched on it earlier in our conversation about the big cities. So there are major league medical facilities in major league cities. And Heath and I were lucky to live in San Francisco, which was fantastic. So the first thing I would say is one, medicine, and particularly with or disorders like Tessa, but across the whole spectrum, because we're in a world We inhabit the world of special needs children. The medicine is so much more than it was 20 years ago. There's so much more hope. I remain committed to the belief that at some point in the next 20 years, they're going to develop this AI helmet. We're going to pop it on Tessa's head because we're going to keep her alive. Bang, she's going
to say all the things.
It's just like a Bewitched episode, and she's just going to become whatever normal is. And who knows whether she'll be grateful for our kind attention for those 40 years or not. So the first thing I would tell everybody, because we meet parents all the time who have a child who has a seizure, young, where are you going to go? What do you do? And we always say, look, Boston Children's is the state of the art. That's where you want to go. We've got contacts there. Talk to these people. And the technology is so much more advanced. The world is so much more than it was 20 years ago. What do I say to parents like that? You got to fight the fight, and you got to be super committed. You got to want to find solutions that aren't often available, maybe in our local area. Yeah. And hopefully you have the time and the space and the energy and the financial wherewithal and all the other factors that you need. But we went to Stanford, the Mayo Clinic, New York Presbyterian Langone, Boston Children's. You go until you find, and here's the other thing, you have to go until you find the person that speaks your language, that you can connect with, that wants to fight the fight with you.
Well, I am very grateful that you came on this show, even though I had to bully you into it a little bit.
Sneak attack. Walk through the door.
But here we are.
But super cool.
And
of course.
Fairly painless.
Pretty painless, by the way. Promise. But it's easy for me to talk about Tessa, and it's a good story to tell, and happy to help in any way, of course.
We also have this fun section at the end called Ask Heather Anything.
Oh, God.
I know.
Ask Heather anything. I don't know what to ask you. I think I know you so well, and I've seen you at your...
at all my points.
I've seen you literally at all your points. Your lowest point. I've seen you in work mode. I've seen you dancing in the bar at Cantina.
It's true.
For the audience members out there. So ask Heather anything. What's your next vacation?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, we're about to enter Empty Nest season 2, so Ethan is getting ready to leave.
And you're bummed.
I am bummed. I'm super bummed. And in mid-September, the day after our September board meeting, we are heading to London and we're doing Oktoberfest again. So we're doing a couple nights in London, and then we're going to Munich with a bunch of our friends. And
as you do.
And I'm, Lederhosen and the Dirndl, all of it's coming back out.
You live a little of that life for us.
I will do that.
Right? And I will be super appreciative.
I will, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend, anybody who might benefit from listening to this. It would make a world of difference if we could just reach more people and share the work that we do and the stories we want to tell. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two.